Hello, I'm Emilee Robbins, a PhD student at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and today I am interviewing Dr. Jodi Bilinkoff, who is a professor here at UNCG. And a little bit about her: she got her MA and her PhD at Princeton University, and some of her research interests focus on religion and gender in early modern Europe, specifically Spain. And she has published several articles and essays, and has published 3 books, including Related Lives, Confessors and Their Female Penitents, from 1450 to 1750. So, I would like to begin our interview with kind of just the initial question of what drew you to study history?
Okay. Hi. All right. Well, and thank you for inviting me, Emilee. This is it's really an honor to be here and fun also to be talking to you. As a good historian, I sort of went back to the beginning. I tried to think back in the beginning, and I realized that even as a child, I loved reading, and it was always at the library, the public library, and I loved to read. But 2 kinds of books that I really liked to read, I'd say especially, were biographies. I loved reading biographies of famous people in the past, and also historical fiction. So, and at the time, let's say when I was 10 years old or something, I don't think I thought of it as studying history exactly, but I was always fascinated by lives in the past, the how people lived, individual people, but also their societies and their families and so on. So looking at the story of people's lives in the past. So it is sort of interesting, let's just say, that eventually when I did become a historian, in fact, I have continued to be very interested in that genre of what sometimes is called life writing, either biography or autobiography, and I've studied that and written about it. So I guess it really does have some roots all the way back in my childhood.
Yeah, some impacts that started early on. And you say that books and going to the library definitely kind of pushed you towards this trajectory toward studying history. Were there any events or experiences or books in particular that you can remember that kind of sparked that initial interest in history?
Yes, and then even more specifically in the history of Spain, which is, especially when I was starting out, was rather an unusual field for people in the U.S. to go into. Not so much Latin American studies, which was well established, or Spanish literature, but history, Spanish history, is still relatively rare to find in history departments in U.S. universities. So Spain, I was incredibly fortunate in that in the summer between being 15 and 16 years old, my cousin, who was about a year older, and I went to Spain for the summer. Back in those days, long time ago, it was very inexpensive to go to Spain. Spain was more of a kind of underdeveloped country than it is now, which was bad for the Spanish people, but good for Americans and others who had money. And so it was actually quite reasonable cost. And this was a program that took high school students, and you stayed with families. My cousin and I both stayed with the same family, and then you went to classes which were Spanish conversation classes for foreigners. So it was fabulous, and it was so unusual to have an experience like that. We were in southern Spain. I was in the city of Malaga, which is right on the Mediterranean coast, and is a city that goes back literally thousands of years. I remember being shown around, and there was what looked like one of these ancient amphitheaters, and I said something like, "Look, there's an ancient Greek amphitheater," or something, and the people who were showing us said, "No, actually, it was built by the Phoenicians." So that's what you call an old city. They still have structures from the Phoenicians, the Greeks, and the Romans, as well as that. So that was pretty astounding. And then about an hour and a half north of Malaga, though, is the city of Granada, and that simply blew me away. And it's still a favorite city of mine and one to go through, that also just has such a unique feeling to it, a city that had been for hundreds of years a Muslim city. It was a city in Muslim Spain and had all that amazing architecture before being reconquered by the Christians. So after that experience, I remember I literally from time to time had dreams about Granada and about the Alhambra Palace. It was just like this magical place. And it did mean that I made a sort of commitment or a vow to actually learn Spanish. And coming out of, American public schools, that was no easy task. I always tell people that I learned Spanish in spite of school, not so much in school. But I really did become determined to do it, and I continued doing it into my college years. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the first things that got me interested in Spanish history, was actually being able to go to Spain.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of brings me to one of my other questions, which is kind of how you settled on. So you had this interest in the location of Spain early on, but how did you settle on the specific topic of, religion and studying people's narratives?
Okay, thank you. Well, what I thought I would talk about is how I settled on a project for my dissertation, when now we're sort of fast forwarding here, and I'm in graduate school, and although there's some things in between, and nowadays there's a term that people like to use, which is intersectionality. This was not in vogue when I was an undergraduate or graduate student, but we were doing it. It was one of those things where there wasn't a word for it, but we were doing it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how my various interests came together, and sort of at the intersection, if you can think of that like a graph, there was something that then became my dissertation topic, my doctoral dissertation, and then my first book. And I'll at the end I'll tell you what the title is, and how that happened. Okay, so you're quite right that I had this interest in Spain and in the Spanish language. When I was an undergraduate, all history majors had to take a sequence of either 2 semesters of either U.S. history or European history, or I think there was Asian history. There were several of those. So I took the European, the 2 sequence, and in the first semester we studied about the Reformation, the period of the Protestant and Catholics Reformation. Meanwhile, this was in the early 1970s. And starting a few years earlier, in the 60s, was a series of events going on in Northern Ireland that came to be known as the Troubles, the time of the Troubles. And it was horrible. It was kind of like civil war in Northern Ireland, with horrific violence and terrorism on both sides, but that divided along Protestant and Catholic lines. Now, as I got older, I read a little bit more about it, although I'm surely not an expert, but having read a little bit more, I came to realize that it wasn't only about religion, that in some case, much of this had to do with economics, with social class, and so on. But at least the labels, if you will, were Protestant versus Catholic. And so that made a tremendous impression on me as a young person, and thinking to myself, wow, that here we are so many hundreds of years later after the Reformation, and yet at least somewhere in Europe, this is still being played out. This is a conflict that hasn't gone away. So that got me really interested in the whole period of the Reformation, which would be let's call it from 1450 to 1650, early modern Europe, and that is in fact my field of specialty, and the courses that I teach here are mostly fall into that category. So that's chronology there. Meanwhile, that period in Spain is also their golden age, what they call the Siglo de Oro, the golden age of Spain, both in terms of Spain being basically a superpower in Europe, something that I think a lot of us have kind of forgotten over time. We're more familiar, of course, that it had an immense empire in Latin America, and what's now Spanish America, an overseas empire, which is why all these people speak Spanish in the Americas. But it was also, but in fact, Spain was a big superpower in Europe as well, and it was also a golden age in terms of culture. It's a time of great writers, poets, playwrights, artists. it's the period of Cervantes, for example, writing Don Quixote, and so on. So all these things kind of, came together in terms of this period. Meanwhile, one other thing was happening in the 70s, and that is the emergence of a whole field that really didn't even have a name before, called women's history. Right? And so I started getting interested in that, and I had wonderful professors. My undergraduate alma mater is the University of Michigan. So I was at the University of Michigan, and I had wonderful professors, most of whom were male. That's where most professors were, and still are, but even more so. But they were very, very supportive. I never had a professor who said, oh, women's history, that's just fluff, or, or just a passing fad or something. They were all very, very supportive. And so I started looking into that, too. So eventually, I came to a figure named Teresa of Avila, who were now known as Saint Teresa of Avila, who was a nun in 16th century Spain, from the city of Avila, right in the middle of Spain, close to Madrid. She lived from 1515 to 1582, and is one of the first women writers in all of Europe to write a full-length autobiography. She wrote her life. So, and other writings as well, and was a religious reformer and a mystic and so on. So in looking at her and her world, was a way of bringing together Spain, religion, women, gender, and urban history. Also, I was very interested in focusing in on a particular city. So since in English anyway, she's known as Saint Teresa of Avila. The title of my dissertation and then my book is The Avila of Saint Teresa. And that's how that happened.
Wow, that is an amazing story. And you mentioned kind of these almost, disparate yet connected kind of interests and fields of study that you brought together in this, in kind of what you study for your work. And during that time, were there any historians or works of history, like secondary works, that really inspired you or influenced your future research and scholarship?
Yeah, boy, and that's one of the many questions you have here, Emilee, in which I really had a hard time trying to coming down with one, because the answer is yes, there were many. I think we all did. I think if we all started out reading about history and finding it boring or something, that would have been the end. But I've had so many that I just loved and had a wonderful time with. So I'll mention one that connects this question and the next one that you have on your list here about with where did you study and with whom did I study. So I thought I would mention one person at least, and her name is Natalie Zeman Davis, who's still alive. She is amazing. She actually just published a book. I believe she is 94 now. Very, very famous historian and a real pioneer in the field of women's history. And I never expected to work with her at all, because so after Michigan, I went to Princeton, as you mentioned, and mainly I was there because there was a very famous historian of Spain named John Eliot, who was at the Institute of Advanced Study, which is in Princeton, and so on. But in my second year, Natalie Davis decided to leave Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, where she had been for many years, and came to Princeton. And so for a group of us, not just myself, it was like, I think of her as like the fairy godmother flying in, to swoop us all up. And she really has been, enormously inspiring and influential, both as a historian and as a teacher. So she's definitely one I would mention. I'll mention one other person, but really I could go on. There's a scholar who also is still around named William Christian. He goes by Bill Christian, who actually has his PhD in anthropology. But he has written both about current day things, or things much more recent in time, where he could actually go and talk to people and do what we would call oral history or ethnography for an anthropologist, but also more the distant past, more like the 16th and 17th century. And his he's written a number of books, but one book is called Local Religion in Early Modern Spain. And he talks about why he prefers the term local religion over popular religion. And so that book, which in any case God was able to get in and try to ask questions about what did religion really mean to people at the time, not just looking at who was the Pope and who were the bishops and who were the people on top, or what were the influential writings even, but things like who did people pick as saints to pray to, or where did people go when they needed to pray for more rain for their crops, and questions like that, which I think most of us had never even thought about, that those were questions one could ask about things that happened 500 years before.
Yeah.
So he was because it was that area of Spain that I worked on, I would say that he's another scholar who's influenced me a lot. But don't get me started, because I could mention many more.
No, that's amazing, and it's amazing I would love to hear more stories about Natalie Zemon Davis.
She's
but
incredible.
But I guess you mentioned kind of Natalie Zemon Davis as being an influential teacher as well, and so I think that's a good segue into kind of your own teaching, and maybe if you could talk a little bit about some of the courses that you have taught here or teach here currently, and maybe some of your favorite courses that you look forward to kind of teaching.
Yes, definitely. But can I just quickly answer the
of
question
course.
you had about what a publication of mine I'm most proud of?
Yes, of course.
I'm proud. I was relieved to get all of these books done. But I'll tell you something I'm proud of, and now you see the background to this. This book that I mentioned, called The Avila of St. Teresa, was translated into Spanish and published in Spain.
Wow,
I'm really proud of that.
Yes.
Now, but teaching. So first, just to tell you about what are the courses that I teach here at UNCG. Right. Here are the ones that I teach the most commonly, or on a much regular basis. And there's other sort of like special topics, things that have come on. I teach History 222, which is the survey of Europe from 1400 to 1789. I don't go past July 13th, 1789, and you know why. So I do not include the French Revolution, Napoleon, and so on, because there's so much to do in the period of the Renaissance, Reformation, and so on. And in fact, after 1492, it becomes transatlantic. So it's Europe, but also in looking across the Atlantic. I also that's at a 200 level. I have two 300 level courses that I teach quite often. One is History 315, which is I'm teaching this semester, which is called Witchcraft and Magic in European History, and that's common type of course for someone in my specialty to teach, because it's one distinguishing feature of the period was the so-called witch craze or Great Witch Hunt. In which tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were rounded up and prosecuted on the charge of witchcraft. So it's an extremely fascinating, but also very challenging and sometimes deeply disturbing topic. But great sources, and students always enjoy that. I also have a course, History 369, and this is when you've talked about what's the favorite course. So it's not, it's a special, I would say, maybe not favorite exactly. I have a course called History 369, which is my course on early modern Spain. Well, it's actually, I call it Spain and its empire in its golden age. I do a survey going back to the very earliest settlements in Iberian Peninsula, but then we stop and really focus on the period from about 1450 or so to 1700. And I must say that I just feel tremendously privileged to have been able to teach a course in my own specialty here. That is not something to take for granted by any stretch. So I've enjoyed that, and I hope other students have too. I also teach quite regularly both History 391, which is the prerequisite research methods course, and then 411B, because it's in European history, which is the capstone research seminar. So I also enjoy those in a different way, because that's when you have smaller courses, all the students are history majors. And so we start to really kind of roll up our metaphorical sleeves and get to work. And students start actually doing their own research. And I, try my best to guide them through the process.
Yeah, and for any, I guess, listeners of this interview who are aspiring teachers themselves, would there be any tips that you have for being an effective teacher or planning ahead whenever you're teaching a course or something like that?
I don't know too much about the planning. Here's something I thought of, and but I'll think about the other thing that you just mentioned here. I got this idea from another colleague from UNCG many years ago, and that is that when you're in the classroom, try to make eye contact with students. It seems so basic, but nobody ever tells you that, which I have to say is one of the reasons why I don't think I could ever teach an asynchronous online course. When I did during this pandemic, obviously we all had to do what we all had to do, but I taught hybrid courses, and they were synchronous, so I could still at least see the faces. And it was also hybrid because there were students in the classroom, and then on the days that we were all online, at least I could see people's faces that way. It's very hard for me to imagine teaching without seeing students' faces, and even with the masks you can still see their eyes. So I found that helped a lot, actually. I'm trying to think, I had another idea, another tip that I was going to mention. Well, I would just say another thing is, even it's wonderful, I think, that we have in our doctoral program that we have a course a designated course that you teach on teaching methods and so on. I never had one, and I'm jealous of you all. I think that's great, but I think it is also important to keep in mind that much of what we do is based on trial and error. And I've made plenty of errors, during my career. But the key is then to try to pick up from that. And if something just really doesn't work, that you say, okay, I'm going to have to try something different the next time. So it's hard because, you can't help, especially if you put a lot of time and energy into putting together a course or thinking about books to order or something, and then some of them fall flat. It is a little demoralizing, but then the point, then at least you have a little bit of a gap, and then the next semester you can try something else.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I guess kind of moving beyond, your role as a researcher, beyond your role as a teacher, what are some of your interests outside of your historical studies?
I really love music, and I like a lot of different kinds of music, but I'm particularly passionate about classical music. It's a great passion of mine. And so I have to say that it has really been wonderful now that concerts have resumed. I've been going to concerts with my wearing mask and holding, and with my proof of vaccination, but at least they have started up again. So I really love, I'm a real music appreciator that way. I also love travel, and alas, that's been on the back burner for everybody, really, but I'm looking forward to getting back to doing that. I like walking. I'm trying to keep at least a little bit in shape by doing some vigorous walking. I still, in some ways, that sort of childhood love of reading about people's lives and reading about the past has translated into things like watching PBS and watching their dramas that are set in the past, or their documentaries. So I'm a big fan of those kind of PBS and what you can learn from documentaries. So, and I like cooking. So I have other things that I like to do besides teach history.
Yeah. And you mentioned traveling, and one of my questions was, if you could be anywhere in the world right now, where would you want to be?
What I think my answer is to that, it might surprise you, is I think it would be in New York City visiting my sister.
Oh, yeah.
Because I haven't seen her except on a screen for all this time. So But I think after, I'm hopeful this summer, after the semester's over, I think things will be okay, okay with going up to visit her. But
yeah, of course.
Well, it's been a while, and they had terrible, lockdown situation for a long time.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that we didn't want to see each other. It was that, it just wasn't advised. But I think so. But that doesn't mean I don't think about getting back to Spain, too.
Mm.
And then there's parts of the world that I've never visited, so that I look forward to that, too.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you have any advice, kind of as we're winding our interview down, for someone who is perhaps just thinking about getting into a PhD or thinking about going into academia?
Yeah. So here's two things I thought about, Emilee. One is, I think that this is essentially not just for getting the PhD, but wanting to go into academic teaching and so on. I think people have to really stay as flexible as they possibly can, and that is flexible. What I mean by flexible is, for example, in terms of geography. Because I saw this when I was a graduate student too. There was people who said, yes, I'd like a PhD in history, and then I want to teach in the Boston area or on the West Coast or something. Well, boy, that made it so difficult. That doesn't mean that it never happened, but that cut down their options a lot. When I was coming up and coming through, it was like it is now, a terrible job market, very, very tight. So you really had to be willing to go to all sorts of places that maybe you hadn't thought about living before. Does that mean go anywhere in the whole world? Well, maybe not. But if you can keep your options open and not say, I want to teach, but only if it's going to be in the state of North Carolina or whatever, geographically open. The same thing about the kind of institution you might teach at. Again, public versus private, large university versus small. Try to really keep an open mind, so this way you can keep your options open. And you never know. Maybe you never thought that you were a big public university type person, and you thought you would always stay at a small private college, and then it turns out that there's all kinds of things that you didn't know about yourself that might be out there. But then the other thing about, if for somebody who really, really wants to go on and become and get a PhD and become a scholar, I think of something else that was influential from my years as a graduate student, and that was there was a very unique and really groundbreaking musical on Broadway at the time, and I was able to see it, and then since then it's gone around the country and so on. But since I was in Princeton, New Jersey, I was able to sometimes go into New York City and do things like that. And so it's called a chorus line. Mm. And it really resonated for me. This has to do with dancers who are auditioning for a very splashy musical. We're going to do all these dance numbers. So that was about as far away as you could get from what I did. But it felt like we were all auditioning all the time. It felt like that idea of being on the line, and then only, two were going to be picked out of a huge line of 40 or something. That just felt like very, it resonated a lot for those of us in graduate school at the time. But there's a song from that ends that show, in which the people are talking about what it means to have trained all these years and to be a dancer, and now trying to really break into the world of professional dance. And the song is called What I Did for Love. And if you hear the song by itself, I think often people might think it's a love song, a love ballad, maybe even a little bit sappy, like What I Did for. But it's not. I mean, when you listen to the lyrics, and certainly in the context of the show, it's not about, two people loving each other, although those things come up in the show too. It's about what I did, what I was willing to do because it was something I love doing. Mm. So I would remember that.
Well, thank you so much for being a part of this project and for spending, 30 minutes with me just talking about your life. It's been so wonderful.
Thank you, Emilee.